a child was born in Israel. This child was extraordinary if for no other reason than the name he was given. This baby was named Ichabod. And of course, if you remember your Old Testament history, you know the circumstances of that situation. In Hebrew, the word for the glory of God, the weightiness, the significance, the heaviness of God is the Hebrew term kavod or kabod. And here is a child who is named Ichabod, which means literally, the glory of God has departed. The glory of God has gone. It's left. Now, can imagine a little boy growing up in Israel, going to school, to the synagogue, or something. The teacher says, "What's your name, child?" And the child said, "My name is the glory of God has gone." Now, you remember several years ago when the country western singer Johnny Cash sang a song called "A Boy Named Sue." It was a humorous song about a rough and tumble cowboy who named his son Sue, because this father was going to be removed from the scene, and he wanted to make sure that his son would grow up with an appropriate level of macho toughness. And so he called him Sue, because he knew that when that kid went into the saloon or went into the schools and somebody said, "What's your name?" and he said Sue, he was going to have to fight to prove his manhood. But it's one thing for a boy to be called Sue in America. It's another thing in Israel for a child to be called Ichabod. The glory of God has gone. Well, why? What happened? Well, to understand that incident in Jewish history, that episode in the Old Testament, we have to just go back a couple of chapters earlier, where during the time of the leadership of the Jewish people, of the venerable judge Eli, a crisis came to the nation. The traditional military enemy of Israel were the Philistines. And the Philistines came in battle against the Jewish people during the reign of Eli. And the scripture tells us in the 4th chapter of 1 Samuel that in this battle, the Philistines drew up to meet Israel, and the battle spread, and Israel was defeated before the Philistines, and 4,000 Jewish men died in the conflict. And so a messenger came back to Shiloh, came back to the central sanctuary, and reported to the leaders and the elders there and to Eli himself of this humiliating defeat in battle. And the soldiers and the messengers came with an urgent request. They said to the judge, they said to Eli, "Eli, let us go back again into battle against the Philistines, only this time, please, let us take the Ark of the Covenant with us." Sort of an Old Testament Raiders of the Lost Ark. You remember that the Ark of the Covenant was the most sacred piece of furniture in the tabernacle and later in the temple. The Ark was that chest where the cherubim adorned the sides of it, and the Ark was the throne of God. And its cover was the mercy seat, where the blood of the sacrifices were spread. And inside this chest was contained the tablets that Moses had brought down from Sinai, Aaron's rod, and so on. This was the sacred vessel of all sacred vessels to the Jewish people. And there were moments in previous history that when the Jews went into battle against their enemies, when the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant, the throne of their God, Yahweh, before them, whenever God's throne marched into battle, the Jewish soldiers were always victorious. And so now, after losing to the Philistines, they come and they press their urgent request upon Eli. Let us go back, let us go with the Ark of the Covenant. And he said, all right. And so the ark was brought into the Jewish camp. Listen to the response of the people. And it happened as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp that all of Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth itself resounded. When the troops who were demoralized and had just gone through this ignominious defeat saw the approach of the throne of God, they were throwing their hats in the air, they were hurling their weapons in joy, and with one voice they screamed in acclamation. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, what does the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean? And then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, and the Philistines were afraid, and they said, God has come to this place. Woe unto us! Nothing like this has happened before. Woe unto us! Who shall deliver us from the hands of this mighty God? Isn't this the mighty God who defeated the chariots of Egypt? And they were terrified. But there was nowhere for the Philistines to retreat. And so the battle took place. And this time, of course, the outcome was different. In this battle, not 4,000 Jewish soldiers were killed, but 30,000 Jewish men were slain. Once again, the Philistine host was victorious, and they captured the Ark of the Covenant. And in this selfsame battle, the two sons, the undisciplined sons of Eli, perished on the battlefield. And so a man from the tribe of Benjamin was dispatched to carry back the news of the defeat to Shiloh, to Eli. And Eli sat by the gate, and the Bible tells us that he was 98 years old and that he was obese. He was massively overweight, and he had become blind in his old age. And as he sat there listening for some word of the outcome of this battle, the messenger came up to him and reported the news. And the man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And Eli said, how did things go, my son? And the one who had brought the news answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. And your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. And how's that for a report? We lost the battle, 30,000 slain, and Eli, it included your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. But even with this grim aspect of the message, there is still no visible response from Eli until the messenger added, and the Ark of the Covenant has been taken into the camp of the Philistines. Verse 18, it came about when he mentioned the ark of God that Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate. His neck was broken and he died. In the next verse, it says his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant and was about to give birth. And the messenger comes to Phinehas' wife, and what does he say to her? He announces to her, your husband was killed today. Your brother-in-law was killed today. And your father-in-law has just dropped dead. And the Ark of the Covenant has been captured by the enemy. When she heard that announcement, she fell on the ground, went into labor, bore a child, and immediately upon producing this child, she died. And somebody came and picked up this infant who was born in the midst of such calamity and said of the child, His name is Ichabod. The Ark of the Covenant, the throne of God, the glory of God is gone. This is a day that will live in infamy. Meanwhile, as there is mourning and grief and consternation in the household of Israel, back among the chiefs and the princes and the kings of the Philistines, there is tremendous rejoicing. We read in chapter 5 that the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Now you remember that the Philistines were a nation that were made up chiefly of 5 city-states. And each of these great cities was ruled by a king. The cities of Gath, of Ashkelon, of Ashdod, and so on were the great cities of the Philistines. And so when the ark was captured, first of all, it was taken to the city of Ashdod. And there in triumphal procession, this trophy of military victory was taken to the temple of Dagon. Dagon was the chief deity of the Philistines. And everyone went out to celebrate. And when they took the Ark of the Covenant into the temple of Dagon, they set the throne of God, of Yahweh, at the feet of the statue of Dagon. Symbolizing what? The preeminence of the Philistine god who now lords it over the God of the Israelites. And they left the ark in the temple and went out to celebrate. And they celebrated all night, and in the morning when the priests came into the temple of Dagon, they were horrified with what they found. They looked, and behold, the statue of Dagon had fallen over on its face and was now in a position of obeisance, prostrated at the base of the throne of Yahweh. And they scrambled to correct that indignity, and they propped up their statue again in the position of superiority and went back for some more feasting and celebration. They came in the next morning, and they found the statue of Dagon not only tilted over on its face, but this time smashed into a million pieces. And one of the southern Philistines looked at that and said, "Daggone." Well, to make matters worse, suddenly a plague broke out in Ashdod. Now, we don't know exactly the nature of that plague. One translation of the Bible describes the plague as a plague of tumors. Another one describes it as a plague of amarods. But those that are more graphic in their interpretation of the Hebrew say that it was a plague of hemorrhoids. God has a sense of humor. I would have liked to have owned the Preparation H franchise among the Philistine towns at that point. But this terrible plague of hemorrhoids attacks the people of Ashdod. And in the wake of this plague of tumors comes a plague of rats, a rapid infestation of rodents crawling everywhere and bringing disease and destruction to the city. And when this happened, the king of Ashdod began to wonder, is there a connection between the calamity that has befallen our city and the presence of the Jewish throne of God? He said, I don't know. But he decided to make a gift of the throne of God to the king of the closest city in Philistia. And so for several months, what happened in Philistia was the Philistine kings played musical ark. They shifted to Gath. They shifted to Ashkelon. They shifted all around the nation. And everywhere the Ark of the Covenant went, the plague of tumors broke out and the plague of rats broke out until the kings of the Philistines had all of this stuff that they could stand, and they decided to have a summit meeting, and they called a great council where they met together, and they called in their magicians, they called in their priests, they called in their leaders, and they said, what are we supposed to do in these circumstances? The Philistines called on their priests, saying, what shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we shall send it to its place. And the priest and the magician said, if you send away the ark of the God of Israel, don't send it back empty. But you shall surely return to him a guilt offering. If you want these plagues to stop, if you want these tumors and these rats to go away, you not only have to take this sacred vessel back to Israel, but you must take with it a guilt offering to appease the wrath of Yahweh. And the king said, well, what kind of a guilt offering shall we send? And the priest said, you shall fashion 5 tumors of gold and 5 golden rats, pure gold, and send them back as a peace offering to God. And then this instruction followed. Now therefore take and prepare a new cart and 2 milk cows in which there's never been a yoke, and hitch the cows to the cart and take their calves home away from them, and take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, put the articles of gold which you return to him as a guilt offering in a box by its side, and then send it away that it may go. And watch it. Watch where it goes. We're going to put a test out there. Before I tell you about the test, let's stop for a second, recap, see what we've learned already about the Philistines. Well, so far we've learned that the Philistines had military strength. We've learned that the Philistines were a religious people, but that their religion was a religion of idolatry. And what we're going to learn in just a moment, that in spite of the fact that they had all of the trappings of religion, despite the fact that they had a priesthood, despite the fact that they had a temple, despite the fact that they believed in certain deities, bottom line, the Philistines were practical atheists. That is, in theory, they believed in religion and in God. But in actual practice, fundamentally, they were atheists. Now, how do I know that? Well, I know it from what comes next in the story. Let's look at it. Send away this cart with the milk cows and watch it. If it goes up by way of its own territory to Beth-Shemesh, then he, that is God, has done this great evil. But if not, then we shall know that it was not his hand that struck us, but that it happened to us by chance. Let's take a practical look at things. Let's put the situation to the test. We don't know whether this terrible outbreak of the plague of rats and of tumors was merely a coincidence, a fortuitous event, or whether it was the hand of God upon us. We only see 2 possibilities. Either it was God or it was chance. And so we'll put this scientific experiment together and see what happens with the cows and the cart and the guilt offering that we're sending back. If the cows go one direction, we'll come to the conclusion that yes, God was behind this. If it goes the other direction, we'll know that it happened by chance. They considered the possibility that something happened by chance. That's the conclusion that leads me to believe that at bottom they were atheists. Some of you are looking at me with puzzled looks in your eyes. How in the world does that indicate atheism? Let me explain it for you. A few years ago, I had the responsibility in the seminary to teach the theology of the Westminster Confession of Faith, that document that was produced in the 17th century in England by the Westminster Divines that is the most comprehensive, systematic expression of historic Reformed theology ever set on paper. And I had done the first chapter of the confession, then I finished the second chapter of the confession, and I announced after that, I said, next week we're going to take up chapter 3. Which chapter is entitled, Of God's Eternal Decrees. Now, as soon as I announced that, there was a stir among the students. I mean, they knew what that meant. They said, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. That means he's going to get into predestination and all that juicy stuff that has to do with God's sovereignty and human freedom and the things that every theological student in seminary likes to argue into the night. So the next Monday evening, when I came to the classroom, there were 150 students there. There were like 50 guests. Every one of my Reformed students went out and drugged one of their Arminian friends by the neck. They said, our professor's going to speak on predestination this week, and you have to be there and listen. So I have these people waiting, breathless anticipation to look at this difficult doctrine. And I began by reading the opening words of chapter 3 of the Westminster Confession. Let me read them for you now. Chapter 3 begins with these words, God, from all eternity, did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and immutably, that is, unchangeably, ordain whatsoever comes to pass, semicolon. Let me state it again in other words. That God, from all eternity, according to his holy counsel, doth freely and immutably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Semicolon. I read that and I stopped and I said to the class, I said, all right, how many of you believe that? How many of you believe that God foreordains every single thing that happens? Automobile accidents, train wrecks, the birth of baby, the death of your spouse. God ordains it. Everything that comes to pass. How many of you believe it? 100 hands went up. These were Reformed students. These guys were fighting for the angels. This was old hat to them. They didn't have any problem with it. I said, okay, how many of you don't believe it? 50 hands went up. I said, fine. I said, okay, let me ask another question. How many of you would freely acknowledge that you are atheists? And I said, don't be afraid. Tell the truth. Nobody's going to take down names. Nobody's going to report you to authorities. Nobody's going to take out matches and burn you at the stake. How many of you would call yourselves atheists? And nobody put their hand up. And I was flabbergasted. I immediately went into my Lieutenant Columbo routine. You know, I said, wait a minute. I said, there's just one thing I don't understand here. And then I said, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? I was talking to the wife the other night, and she said, I just can't figure this out. And I played this little game with him, and I said, let me see if I get this straight. You're telling me you don't believe that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, but you're not an atheist. I can't put those two together. I said, don't you realize that so far, up to the semicolon of what I've read, this statement in the Westminster Confession has nothing in it that is distinctively Calvinistic or Reformed. It has nothing in it that's even uniquely Christian. Every Jew would affirm what I've just read. Every Muslim would affirm what I've just read. Any cogently thinking theist would have to affirm what I just read. We haven't even gotten to the Reformed doctrine of predestination yet. All it says is that from all eternity God ordains whatsoever comes to pass. I said, what that statement affirms is that God is sovereign over everything that happens. But the great Augustine in the 4th century made the comment, carefully now, think carefully, that God ordains, at least in some sense, everything that comes to pass. It may be in a passive sense, what some people call God's will of permission. That's a little bit misleading, that term, as if he gives his endorsement or sanction on your sin. He permits your sin in the sense that he doesn't stop you from doing it, but he doesn't sanction it. But any time that you commit a sin, God at that moment always had the power to prevent you from doing it. He could have squashed you like a bug, taken the breath out of your lungs at that minute and stopped you from doing it. And the fact that he didn't intervene, that he didn't intrude, the fact that he decided to let you do it, not with his blessing, but to give you the ability to do it without preventing you from doing it, in a certain sense, you see, he chose that it should come to pass. Because he is absolutely sovereign over everything that happens. And I said, do you realize that if there's one maverick molecule running loose in this cosmos, beyond the pale, beyond the scope of God's sovereign control and authority, you have no reason as a Christian to believe a single promise of the future that God has made. One maverick molecule could destroy all of the plans, not only of mice and men, but of Almighty God, if God does not ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Remember when you were children, you learned a little story. For one of the nail, the shoe was lost. For one of the shoe, the horse was lost. For one of the horse, the rider was lost. For one of the rider, the battle was lost. For one of the battle, the war was lost. All because one nail. When I was a boy, one of my heroes was a race driver by the name of Bill Vukovich, who was killed in the Indianapolis 500. When that super expensive piece of machinery, a prototype, costing tens of thousands of dollars to build and construct, failed in a turn because a 10-cent cotter pin broke. A grain of sand in the kidney of Oliver Cromwell changed the course of history. A piece of lead in the brain of John F. Kennedy changed the course of American history. At the Battle of Fort Duquesne in the French and Indian War, a young lieutenant had 5 horses shot out from under him, and one bullet from an enemy rifle went through his shirt as it flapped in the breeze, and it went in one side of his shirt and out the other side of the shirt without even creasing the skin on his back. And he survived that battle, and George Washington became the first president of the United States. You know, 1/10 of an inch, and he wouldn't have survived that battle of Fort Duquesne. But by chance, he made it. Through the fortunes of circumstances, Kennedy was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know. One maverick molecule outside the authority of God's sovereign control could thwart his plans and prevent the return of Christ, could prevent the vindication of faith that you hold dear. Beloved, there is no such thing as chance. I was in a discussion once with a professor at Harvard University. He taught in the graduate school at Harvard in the field of the philosophy of science. And we were talking about the origin of the cosmos. And he didn't believe in God, and I said, well, where do you think the universe came from? And he said, well, the universe was created by chance. And I said, the universe was created by chance. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. I said, are you telling me that the power supply for everything that is, the Big Bang of the entire universe, that was ultimately caused by chance? And he said, yes. I said, that's amazing. I said, don't you realize that chance can't do anything? He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, let me show you what I mean. And I took a coin out of my hand, out of my pocket, and I said, I'll say to you here, if I took a 50-cent piece and balanced it on my thumb, and I said to you, I'm going to flip this coin up in the air, what are the chances that it comes up head or tails? What's the chances? Go ahead. 1 in 2. What's the percentage? 50-50. No. 50-50. Now listen to what I said. I said, if I flip the coin, what are the chances that it comes up heads or tails? 100%. Unless it stands on its edge somehow. I fooled you, didn't I? Okay, what we mean, though, is I said, okay, if I flip that coin, what are the chances that it'll come up heads? 50-50, a 50% chance. Because there are only two options. There's only two sides to the coin. And so we say the odds are, the chances are, that it'll come up heads 50% of the time. Now, what I asked this gentleman from Harvard was, how much influence does chance exert on the flip of the coin? What causes that coin to come up heads? Does it have anything to do with where I start, whether it's heads up or tails up? How much pressure I exert with my thumb, the density of the atmosphere, how many revolutions it makes, whether I catch it here, here, or here, and after I catch it, whether I turn it over or don't turn it over. There are all those variables. We could add to those variables so many complexities that would drive us nuts trying to predict how it's going to turn out. But we can cut the Gordian knot. We can reduce the options to the simple options that are there mathematically. The mathematical possibilities are there can be 1 and 2. And so I say the chances are 50-50 that it's going to come up heads. But how much power, how much force does chance exert? Absolutely none. I said to that professor, chance cannot do anything because chance isn't anything. He said, what do you mean? I said, the word chance is a word that we use, a cipher, a symbol, to describe mathematical possibilities. You're now giving to chance not just an empty word to describe possibilities, you're giving it being, power, ability to do work. I said chance can do nothing because chance is not a thing. It's not an entity. It is no thing. Let me say it again. It is no thing. Faster. It is no thing. Even faster. It is nothing. Do you see that? Chance has no being, and if it has no being, it has no power. For something to do something, it first must be. And when I said that, that good professor went like this. He says, of course, what could people? Well, he says, I can't believe I made that mistake. Isn't it interesting that some of the most foolish mistakes are the kinds of mistakes made by the most learned and brilliant of people? Chance can't do anything. What are the chances that the universe was created by chance? Huh? Not a chance. Because to say that the universe was created by chance is to say that the universe was created by nothing. And I realize that there are intelligent people who say that. In effect, because people are saying that the universe created itself. That's madness. For something to create itself, to be self-created, would require what? For something to create itself, it would have to be when? Before it was. To create itself, it would have to be before it created itself to be what it is that's giving me a headache. It would have to be and not be at the same time and in the same relationship. The most fundamental violation of reason is to say something like that. Nothing can create itself. Nothing can do nothing. And people argue about creation, and I say to them, do you believe that anything exists now? Do you exist now? Is there anything here? Even if you think it's all an illusion, do you think the illusion's here? I say, where'd it come from? Ladies and gentlemen, if anything exists now, this is elementary, then there never could have been a time when there was nothing. Because the most fundamental maxim of all reason and all science and all philosophy is the maxim ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. If there was ever a time when there was nothing, the only thing there could possibly be now couldn't possibly be now. Because the only thing there could be would be nothing. And nothing is not something. Not even a little something. Not even a microscopic something. Not even a subatomic something. It is nothing. And if there was ever a time that there was nothing, there would be nothing now. So there always had to be something. Something that had the very power of being within itself, or nothing could possibly be. Is there anything more elementary than that? If the equation is God or chance, the only possible solution, ladies and gentlemen, is God. Because chance can do nothing. Well, what does that mean about atheism? I said, if you believe in chance, that things happen by chance, what you're saying is God is not sovereign. I've never met a Christian yet. I've met plenty of people who weren't Christians who denied the sovereignty of God, but I've never met a Christian who said, I do not believe in the sovereignty of God. Every Christian says he believes in the sovereignty of God. But it takes about 5 minutes to probe that to discover that not 1 out of 100 Christians believe in the sovereignty of God. As soon as you begin to examine it, there's precious little sovereignty left. If God is not sovereign, God is not God. It's that simple. And so I say the Philistines, with their doctrine of chance, were basically atheists. Now again, give them some credit. They were pre-scientific. They were primitive people. They didn't have the benefit of the scientific revolution, did they? And nobody in this day and age would attribute power or reality to chance. Don't I wish? The dominant view of the origin of the cosmos, the dominant view of the origin of the human race in our culture is that both man and his world have come by, from, and through chance. Now, if you don't give ontological status to chance, they'll still say that it still came by this chance, random collision of molecules or of atoms that happened for no reason at all. Examine that carefully, and it's the same idea of something out of nothing. Well, let's see what happens with the experiment. So the men did so, and they took the 2 milk cows and hitched them to the cart and shut up their calves at home. And they put the ark of the Lord on the cart and the box with the golden mice and the likenesses of their hemorrhoids. And the cows took the straight way in the direction of Beth-Shemesh, and they went along the highway, lowing as they went, and did not turn aside to the right or to the left. And the lords of the Philistines followed them to the border of Beth-Shemesh. I love this story. I don't know anything about farming or about the cattle industry. I have a man here in the studio audience tonight who has his PhD in cows, and he's tried to help me struggle through this text. I always thought, from singing the Christmas carols, the cattle are lowing. I thought that meant that they were sort of like purring, like contented kittens. Like Elsie, the contented cow. I thought that this kind of meant that when these cows were going to their destiny and following the route that they were traveling on the road to Beth-Shemesh, that the fact that they were lowing meant that they were joyful in their task, and they were sort of moving along singing, "Onward, Christian cows." But I've been corrected by that, and they say, no, what's happening here is that the Philistines, in their experiment, are trying to get the cows to act contra naturam, against nature. That when a cow has a calf, and that cow has never been yoked, put on a cart before, that the natural impulse of that mother cow is to be with her calf. And you take that mother cow away from her calf and put her on a cart and just let her loose, nature would say that she would make a beeline back to her calf. But instead, these cows go straight for Israel, straight for Beth-Shemesh, turning neither to the left or to the right, lowing, crying as they go. But no matter how sad and torn they are obedient to the sovereignty of God's providential rule. And they crossed the border into Israel and came to the threshing field of Joshua in Beth-Shemesh. And the scriptures tell us that these cows that hadn't moved to the left or to the right marched up carrying their cargo and stood on the stone floor of Joshua. And when the Jewish people saw them coming, the word went through the community. Everybody gathered around. They could recognize as this cargo approached that these cows were bringing back to Israel the Ark of God. The Bible doesn't say it happened, but I'm sure one of the lookouts, when he recognized what was coming back across the border of Israel, screamed at the top of his lungs, "Kabod! The glory of God has come back." And as the people celebrated the return of the throne of God, they dismantled the cart, took the treasure, carefully prepared the Ark of the Covenant, and the cow stood there on the stone. And the farmers were so happy that they wanted to offer a burnt sacrifice of thanksgiving to God. And so they took the cart and cut it up into firewood And as the cow stood there in obedience, they put the wood underneath them, and they kindled it and sacrificed the cows on that spot. Centuries later, God sent a lamb on a mission. In his providence, God ordained from the foundation of the world that this lamb should go to an altar to be slain as a sacrifice. And the record of history was that this lamb, as he was led to the slaughter, opened not his mouth, but neither did he turn to the left, nor did he turn to the right, but he went with his face set as a flint toward Jerusalem, to the place of sacrifice. Do you think that happened by chance? Do you think that the Lamb of God went forth to die perchance? Or did God, from the foundation of the world, freely and immutably, by the holy and wise counsel of his will, ordain that it should come to pass? Nothing that ever happens to you happens by chance. If God is God, then he is sovereign. And if he is sovereign, there are no maverick molecules. And no maverick molecules, no accidents. No accidents, nothing happens by chance. What are the chances that God would leave your redemption to chance? Not a chance.